the place where the state lost control. Before anything else, I need to ask you for one thing. Take a deep breath, because what you're about to hear is not just a crime story, it's a story about abandonment, about fear, about wrong choices that cost 111 lives and marked Brazil forever. Imagine a place built for 3,000 people, but holding more than 7,000. Imagine dark, overcrowded corridors, where silence was worth more than any law, where survival depended on invisible alliances, where every step could be your last. That place existed, and it stood in the heart of the largest city in the country. We're talking about Carandiru, officially called the São Paulo House of Detention. And on October 2nd, 1992, it became the stage of the greatest tragedy in the Brazilian prison system. But before we get to that day, we need to understand how everything led up to it. A prison that turned into a city, Carandiru was not just a prison, it was a walled city. Inside, there were its own rules, a parallel economy, clearly defined hierarchies, and one cruel truth. The state no longer ruled there. Prisoners moved freely all day long. Cells were locked only at night. Unarmed guards tried to control pavilions with hundreds of men each. And where control disappears, someone fills the space. Inside Carandiru, everything had a price. A place to sleep, a bar of soap, medicine, a better meal, even the right not to die. Those who couldn't pay paid another way. The law there was not the penal code. It was the law of silence, the law of force, the law of alliances. And this became even more evident in one specific place. Pavilion 9, the pressure cooker. Among all Carandiru's pavilions, one was feared even by the most hardened inmates. Pavilion 9. Most of the prisoners there were first-time offenders, men still awaiting trial, people who didn't yet know the unwritten rules of prison. It was a powder keg. Constant fights, conflicts over small debts, disagreements that on the outside might end in an argument, but inside could end in something irreversible. And that's exactly what happened. The Friday that began like any other Friday, October 2nd, 1992. The atmosphere felt almost normal. Prisoners cleaned the pavilion for the weekend visits. There was even an internal soccer tournament happening that day. Nothing suggested that a few hours later that place would enter history. Until an apparently trivial argument began. A small debt, a few grams of drugs, a demand, a disrespect, two men, two sides, and pride no one was willing to swallow. The fight spread quickly, not like an organized rebellion, but like a domino effect. Other inmates got involved. Old grudges resurfaced. Tension rose. And then a decision was made. When information goes wrong, everything falls apart. Prison officers tried to intervene. They tried to lock the prisoners in earlier, but the inmates refused. Not because they wanted a rebellion, but because no one really understood what was happening. That was when the information left the pavilion and arrived distorted. Outside, the message was clear and frightening. Pavilion 9 is out of control. There is an ongoing rebellion. The alarm was triggered, and when that happens, the protocol changes. From that moment on, Carandiru stopped being a prison and became a police case. The machine starts to move. Within minutes, patrol cars arrived, specialized troops, dogs, heavy weapons. Command of the operation changed hands. What was at stake now wasn't just control of the pavilion, but the image of the state on a weekend just before municipal elections. Order needed to be swift and definitive. But no one seemed to realize that a misjudgment can cost far more than time. Meanwhile, inside, prisoners watched the news on television. They saw the siege closing in. Fear took over. Some tried to improvise defenses. Others hid in their cells praying to survive. And then, the final decision was made. And this is where the story changes forever. When the door opened, sometimes history changes not because of a grand plan, but because of a decision made under pressure. And that Friday afternoon outside Pavilion 9, pressure was everywhere. Political pressure, institutional pressure, emotional pressure. More than 300 police officers were positioned there. Men trained for confrontation, for urban warfare, not for mediation. Among them, units of the São Paulo military police, including elite forces like Rota. On the other side of the gate, more than 2,000 prisoners, many without a final conviction. Some there for only a few months, others simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Between these two worlds, an iron gate. The order no one wanted to own to this day. There's a question never fully answered. Who gave the final order? Officially, the operation was under the command of Colonel Uberaton Guimarães. The governor at the time later said that, had he been there, he would also have authorized the entry. But in that moment, what mattered wasn't who would sign the decision, but what it would cause. Water to the pavilion was cut. Electricity was shut off. Inside, darkness intensified the panic. Prisoners banged on bars. They screamed. They tried to communicate. There was no structured negotiation. No leaders called for dialogue. Time passed, and around 4:25 p.m., the decision was carried out. The exact moment, everything changes. The gate began to open. That sound, according to survivors, is something no one ever forgets. Because in that moment, everyone inside understood the same thing. Now it's every man for himself. The first officers entered in formation, shields in front, weapons aimed. The corridors of Pavilion 9 were narrow, dark, cells on both sides. Any mistake there would be irreversible. And that's exactly what happened, what the prisoners say happened. According to dozens of survivors, there was no time for explanation, no clear warning, no chance for collective surrender. Many prisoners were inside their cells, doors closed. Others were in the corridors, not knowing where to run. Reports say that in the first minutes, shots were fired, not as a response to a coordinated attack, but as an advance. Prisoners threw themselves on the ground, hands on their heads, trying to show they posed no threat. Some shouted their names, others cried for their mothers. Fear consumed everything. And it's important to be clear here. This is not glorifying crime. This is not claiming absolute innocence. This is about proportionality, about control, about the responsibility of the state. Inside the cells, one image appears repeatedly in testimonies. Prisoners locked in, lying on the floor. No way to escape. Some say they heard footsteps approaching. Others report confused orders. Some were spared, others were not. There are accounts of police officers who tried to restrain excesses, who told prisoners to stay quiet, who saved lives. But there are also accounts of clear abuses, executions, violence beyond what was necessary. The problem is that at that point there was no effective command anymore. The machine had already spun out of control. The official version. The official narrative was straightforward. Police entered to contain a rebellion. They were met with improvised weapons. There was a confrontation. 111 prisoners died. According to this version, officers acted in self-defense. But when forensic teams entered the pavilion the next day, something didn't add up. The silence after the storm. The next morning, Pavilion 9 was unrecognizable. Blood running down stairways. Bodies scattered. Cells marked by gunfire. Forensics found most shots were fired from top to bottom. Many prisoners were hit in the head and chest. Few weapons were recovered. none compatible with the story of a large armed confrontation. Then came the number that shocked the country: 111 dead, a number that still echoes today. Part 3, the day after never ended. The problem with major tragedies is that they don't end when the noise stops. Sometimes the worst begins afterward, when silence takes over, when the smell is still in the air, when bodies are counted. The day after the invasion of Pavilion 9, Carandiru no longer looked like a prison. It looked like a war zone. The forensic entry on Saturday morning, forensic experts, journalists, and members of the judiciary entered the pavilion, and what they found did not match the official version. Stairs stained, walls pierced, cells too quiet. The bodies had been removed, but evidence was everywhere. And that's when the uncomfortable questions emerged. Details no one could explain, forensics highlighted a key point. Most shots were fired from top to bottom. Many hit lethal areas: head, chest. There were no clear signs of prolonged confrontation. Very few weapons were found with prisoners, none consistent with a large-scale armed clash. More than that, several inmates died inside their cells, places where there was no way to attack or flee. These findings spread, and the official narrative began to crack. A divided country. Outside the walls, Brazil split in two. On one side, they were criminals. The police did what had to be done. On the other, the state cannot decide who lives and who dies. This division wasn't just political, it was emotional. Because Carandiru touched something deep. How society sees those behind bars. Families without answers. For the families of the dead, there was no time for, and crime wasn't either. Fear that turned into unity before Carandiru. Brazilian prisons were dominated by fragmented groups, regional disputes, old rivalries, disorganization. What happened in Pavilion 9 sent a clear message: alone, you are nothing. Because that day, it didn't matter if a prisoner was respected, had allies, was strong or weak. When the gate opened, everyone was just a potential target. And that created something powerful: collective fear. But fear, when shared, can become something else, the seed of something big. In the years following the massacre, prisoners began talking more to one another. Not about crimes, but about protection, about unity, about organization, about never again allowing something like that to happen without response. It was in this context that, in 1993, inside another São Paulo prison, the Primeiro Comando da Capital, the PCC, was born. And no, this is not justification. It is historical consequence. The group's early discourse itself cited Carandiru as a symbol of injustice and state abandonment. A logic that spread the massacre taught prisoners a harsh lesson. State violence is organized. To survive, they would also need organization. From then on, prisons stopped being merely places of sentence execution and became centers of articulation. Stricter internal rules, prohibition of unnecessary conflicts, discipline, not out of kindness but strategy. The chaos of Carandiru showed that lack of control always ends badly for those on the weaker end. The mistake that repeated itself. The most ironic art and tragic part is that the massacre solved none of the problems it claimed to fight. Overcrowding continued. Lack of structure remained. Violence simply changed form. Instead of visible explosions came silent consequences. The state lost moral authority, and crime gained narrative. Demolition, erase or hide. In 2002, the machines arrived. Carandiru was brought down. The implosion was televised, applauded by many, treated as a new beginning. But demolishing a building doesn't erase what happened inside it. The stories stayed alive in the memories of survivors and of those who lost someone there. Today, where the prison once stood, there is the Parc da Juventude, a beautiful space, open, full of life. And that is not a bad thing, but it is curious how few people know what existed there before. Silence as a choice. Brazil never truly reckoned with Carandiru. There was no official apology, no definitive accountability, no clear statement of this must never happen again. Silence won. And when a society chooses silence, it accepts the risk of repetition. The questions this story forces us to ask, the Carandiru Massacre raises hard questions. How far does state power go? Who controls those meant to control? Where is the line between authority and abuse? And perhaps the most uncomfortable of all, what does it say about us when we accept that some lives are worth less? What remained after everything fell? Some stories end. Others continue to echo even when no one wants to listen. The Carandiru Massacre is one of them. Because when the last shot was fired, when the last body was removed, when headlines faded, Brazil moved on without looking back. But the past never accepts being ignored. The place where people walk today, those who pass through the former prison grounds, find something completely different. Trees, children running, people reading, life. The Parque da Juventude now stands there. And that by itself is beautiful. But there is a silent irony. Many people walk that ground without knowing that exactly there, men spent their final hours in fear, confusion, and abandonment. There are no large signs, no memorial proportionate to the tragedy, no explicit invitation to remember. It's as if the country said, let's pretend this never happened. The legacy no one likes to claim, Carandiru, left deep marks on the prison system, on the relationship between the state and marginalized populations, on how institutional violence is normalized. But perhaps the most dangerous mark is another, the idea that some lives are disposable. Because when a tragedy of this magnitude produces no real accountability, it teaches a silent lesson. This can happen again. Silence as inheritance for decades, Carandiru was remembered more as controversy than as learning. Shallow debates, easy polarization, ready-made phrases. Little was said about prevention, dialogue, structure. And when the past is not learned from, it returns in disguise. Why this story still hurts? You might be asking yourself, why talk about this now? Why reopen this wound? Because ignored wounds don't heal, they fester. And Carandiru explains much about today's Brazil. It explains distrust. It explains brutality. It explains the abyss between those who command and those who obey. This is not about defending crime. This needs to be said clearly. Telling this story is not excusing crime, not romanticizing prison, not attacking all police. It is remembering that the state has limits. And when those limits are crossed, the price is always collective. The 111 lives that became a number. When we say 111 dead, the mind turns it into a statistic. But they were 111 stories, 111 families, 111 interrupted paths, some guilty, others still awaiting trial, all of them, without exception, under state responsibility. The final question, perhaps the most honest question Carandiru leaves us, is this. What kind of country are we when we allow this to happen and move on as if nothing happened? It is not a comfortable question, but it is necessary. Emotional closing, maximum retention. If this story unsettled you, it did its job. Because stories like this were not made to comfort, they were made to remember, to question, to prevent repetition. And as long as Carandiru is treated only as the past, it will continue to be the present.